Okay, so I've decided to do my first ever video, and it's all around the Specialist Under-23 Limited Tournament. Sorare have really stepped up their game in recent months with adding in new special weekly formats for us to try, and the Specialist really caught my eye this week because it's awarding DMPs. There has been a while where DMPs have been discussed, but they've never been formally introduced into the prize pool, so it's really exciting to look at it this weekend, particularly when you see players like Florian Wirtz and Pedri are, what I would classify as star tier DMP cards that could be up for grabs this weekend. There are two separate tournaments, one for under 23 players and one for over 32. Another video will follow this, focusing on the over 32 players, but my understanding is that you can win a DMP player of any age group. So it isn't that if you enter the under 23s you'll win an under 23 DMP. It's simply a way of offering utility to players at either end of their careers. The format itself follows the usual Specialist format, so what you're looking to do is find two players with an average score of below 40 in the last 15 games who can in essence act as facilitators for your team. It's often pretty challenging because you've got risks of rotation, you've got risks of low scores, but I think that's what makes it fun, that's what makes it challenging, and ultimately that's why I believe that this tournament favours people who are willing to put in the time and research as opposed to simply just buying the best players, and that's one of the reasons I really like it. I've decided to put together a shortlist. This will actually be released as a watch list and Sorare data after the video, but to start off I'm just going to run through 10 players that I've picked that are potentially worthy of consideration this weekend. Starting off with the goalkeeper, Franco Herrera. Herrera is a very interesting one, simply because he's probably, I'd say, one of the two goalkeepers this weekend that have a chance of starting, the other being Timothy Faulu, who was formerly of Sion but has just gone on loan to a newly promoted club within the Swiss Super League. But as it stands at this moment in time, I'm more confident that Herrera would start, just because there's more journalistic coverage of Newell's than there is of the club that Faulu now plays for. Ultimately, first choice goalkeeper at Newell's has injured himself in the last game, so Herrera has been running all of the training sessions this week and is predicted to be the starter. You notice the floor has jumped a fair bit now, but last sales are sitting at around 0.5, which is a fairly reasonable price. One thing I will say is that you only need two players in the team that have an L15 under 40, so it is, it's not essential that you go for the goalkeeper route. Personally, I like to, and the reason being is because I believe goalkeepers have limited upside, and what I'm ideally looking for is, of the players who have L15 over 40, you're more confident that in them achieving higher scores. So that's a big reason why I always try to look in my specialist teams for a eligible goalkeeper. But appreciate that particularly with under 23s there is a real squeeze on price with them because there's just so few that are actually eligible. On that point, I have noticed that in the upcoming weeks Sorare will be launching a special weekly that includes only 4 players, which I think is a great way of addressing the issue that has been the eligibility of goalkeepers in these tournaments in recent weeks. Nothing really to note on his SO5 scores, because when it comes to goalkeepers you are simply looking for someone to play. So we will move on now to the defenders. First of 3 is Lautaro Blanco, who is playing for Rosario Central in Argentina. You will see there has been a bit of movement on his price. What are we looking at there? But probably 50% approximately increase in the last couple of days, with everyone noting his eligibility for this tournament. He is a left back, so you will always see an element of volatility to his scoring, but there's some nice peaks in there which gives you some assurances that if he does hit a good game, you could get a fairly decent return from him. The fixture itself versus Independiente is pretty decent. What I try to look at for these recommendations is, not only does the player have a high chance of playing, but what does the fixture look like as well. And actually, I think, of all fixtures that we've got for the players that are eligible this week, Independiente is definitely one of the more favourable ones. What I will say as well, when you see fullbacks, fullbacks tend to get hit harder by possession lost when they're playing at home, simply as a result of increased possession. So playing away isn't necessarily a bad thing for a fullback, because they could get more defensive actions and fewer possession lost. So definitely worthy of consideration when you look at selecting players for this weekend. Next one, moving into Europe. Challenger Europe restarts this weekend with Swiss Super League. We've also got the Danish Superliga and the Russian Premier League starting as well. Matthias Ross stands out because he's again in the similar price range as Lautaro Blanco, but he's a centre back, and he's a centre back that's got a history of scoring goals. He ended the last season scoring a goal against Freiburg, and he starts this season against Freiburg. So in terms of fixtures, it's a decent fixture for him, and he's been in good form in pre-season, and also scored off set piece in the last friendly match as well. So when looking for a player in that L40 L15 under 40 slot, he's definitely one that offers a little bit of upside, which is why I put him in for consideration. One thing I do like about the specialists is the opportunity to bring in affordable players. So, I'm not just going to recommend the more expensive ones. I've got another option here of Nathaniel Santini, who is approximately half the price in terms of last sale as the two players that I've mentioned before. Question, why does he qualify? Well, injuries, to be honest with you. He really struggled towards the end of last season with injuries and COVID. But there's some pretty respectable scores in here. I think for me, I don't think you ever really win it with your under 40 players, but you can certainly lose it. So you're trying to look for one, does the player play? What is that sort of scoring consistency and potential upside? And if you look prior to his injury records, he was in and around the 50 mark, which if you think about it for a specialist weekly, and also the context of under 23s has generally been fairly low scoring recently. I think he's a decent option for the price. Again, he's one player that's been featuring heavily in pre-season, and I think would be odds on to start this weekend for Sion, who have a pretty tough fixture away from home, so don't expect a clean sheet. But I think that Santini will be fairly busy, and the chance of him racking up an AA score with double doubles, triple doubles is pretty high. So that's why I've decided to include him. Next up is the midfielders, and the first one we're going to talk about today is Natas Galaza. Galaza is a player who really comes into consideration because of the movements that have happened in the team around him. Gabriel Florentin and Fausto Vera are both looking like they're on the way out of Argentinos Juniors, and that opens up a slot for him in central midfield. And he really has started to look like he's going to step into that in recent games. He's got a few starts, a few sub appearances, but I think all signs point to him starting this weekend in what is a pretty decent fixture away at Barracas Central. So the great thing about him as well is if we knock out the times when he's been on the bench and when he's come from the sub, his starts are pretty decent. There's some really, really good scores in there for a young player who's still finding their feet within the game. So Galaza is actually a player that I'm really seriously considering putting into my team this weekend. Next up is Joanne Swarsa, who is a colleague of Franco Herrera at Newell's. Swarsa is also a player who is benefiting from teammates potentially moving on, with Nicolas Castro strongly rumoured to Genk. So it gives Swarsa a chance to really step into the team and play that central midfield role that Castro has sort of really made his own in the last 18 months. Again, if we knock out the sub and the bench appearances, there's some pretty respectable scores in here, particularly within his last 10 games. It sort of shows an increased maturity and role within the team, which again I think is really, really good prospect, and he's the sort of player that you could buy and he could offer you under U23 utility after this tournament. It's one thing that I think is a real important factor. Personally, I like to trade in and out of my teams. I don't tend to hold a huge supply of limited cards, so I'm always looking to trade in and out based on the fixtures to build a specialist team. So there's definite consideration around usage beyond the tournament for this player. One consideration is it's not the easiest fixture. Racing Club, albeit at home, is going to be a really tough matchup, but it's a tough matchup that you'd hope would give him the opportunity for defensive AA points, and a score of around about 50 to 55 I think would be an option for this player. Next up, moving into the MLS, is Brian Gutierrez, who has been really sort of growing into a role at Chicago Fire this season. One of the youngest players on the list at 19. Slightly more affordable, so whereas the last two players were in around that 0.012 mark, he's 0.008, so definitely on the more affordable side. Scoring wise, and I think it's why it's ultimately reflected in his price, but picking Gutierrez is essentially a bet on can he get decisive, because his AA game is pretty lacking, if I'll be honest. There's very few, if any, actually there's one there, games where he's gone above 10 points in terms of AA, which for a central midfielder is not great. So, but that's ultimately what you get with these L15 under 40 players, is you are not getting the best of the best. There is always an element of risk and an element of chance involved with these players. Next up, moving on to the forwards, we've got Ozzy Herrera playing down in Atlas in Liga MX. He's risen in price in the last couple of weeks, but that has not been driven by his specialist eligibility. It's simply driven by the fact that he's started. He has been for quite a while a sub. He's been a bit of a super sub at Atlas, grabbed a goal here and there. But what really sort of stands out is his increasing role within the team. Last match he played 90 minutes away to Toluca, and a 12-point AA game for a forward is pretty respectable. So I think that if you're looking to fill with a forward, Ozzy Herrera is definitely one worthy of consideration. And I think again it comes back to that point of can you use them after? Are you just simply buying a player for 1 week to throw away? And for Herrera, I don't think you are. I think you're buying a player that has a genuine chance of establishing himself in the Atlas first team this season. So you've got ongoing utility for that player. Next up is Konstantin Tuakin. Again, this is a player, he's not quite broken into the team just yet in Moscow, but his record from the bench is frankly amazing. He really has, of all the players on this list, demonstrated the ability to get off the bench and grab a goal. So, although I don't think he will start this weekend, I think Fedor Smolov will be the preferred option. Rostov at home is a pretty decent fixture, and considering the amount of times that he's come off the bench to get a goal, I definitely wouldn't have any issues in putting him in that specialist team and sort of rolling the dice on him grabbing a decisive from the bench. Last but not least is a Vancouver player who ultimately is in this list and has benefited from the misfortune of a teammate. Unfortunately, Delibo Casido injured himself pretty seriously in the last couple of weeks, and Pedro Vite has been the player that has ultimately stepped into the team to replace him. Price-wise, 0.012 is not too bad for a under 23 forward, but you've seen there has been a pretty substantial jump on his price in the last couple of weeks. Why is that? Well, ultimately he absolutely smashed it against Minnesota United. Even though the Caps lost 3-1, he grabbed an assist and put up a 22-point AA game, which frankly for a forward puts him in a very, very select company. Fixture-wise, it is Portland away. Portland are a pretty strong team, and they're also a very strong team at home. But the Caps are a sit back and try and catch them on the break team. They are heavily focused on counter-attacking. based on Vite's role in the team, I still think he's got a chance of putting up a respectable score this weekend, simply because of the styles of play and the fact that there's been fixture congestion in the last couple of weeks. Could be some tired legs in Portland, and Vite may be there to be involved in a consolation goal for the Caps on the break. So that is the very, very quick rundown of the 10 players that I'd highlight for under 23 specialists this week. Just to finish off, who have I picked? Well, I have gone with Franco Herrera and Nathaniel Santini as my facilitators. The reason being was because I've got a couple of players here in Oblikov and Isidore who have pretty wonderful fixtures and could roll into forming an under 23 team for me that rolls on beyond this game week. So I hope you enjoyed, I hope you found that valuable, and good luck this weekend.